Hello, 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 hello. Vibe check. Checking the vibes. How are you? Take a minute. Just sit for a sec. Just sit for a sec. Take a big deep breath. Breathe on in. Pull it in. Pull it in as deep as you can. And then exhale. All of it. Get it all out of your lungs. Every last bit of air. And now breathe normally. That felt nice. I'm sure that felt nice. I didn't do it because I was talking. I'm gonna do one. Here we go. Whew. Yeah, the exhale is really important. You want to get all that. They're both important. The inhalation and exhalation are both equally important, but you want to make sure you're clearing out the lungs, you're getting it all, you're soaking it all in, and you're pushing it all out. Vibes for me have been pretty decent, other than Ohio seems to get 3 hours of sunlight per day. I'm obviously, that's a gross exaggeration, but as I'm recording this at at noon, I think the sun it looks like it's already setting outside. It's not. It's just hanging low on the horizon, but it feels like things have been dark. The darkness has crept in, which has been perfect for to lock myself in this space and write my book, which I have been doing. I just finished the first chapter. I'm going to put a link to that chapter. Once I have it a little more revised and edited, I'm going to put a link to that chapter in my Patreon. Oh, what's that? I have a Patreon? Oh, you have a Patreon? Yeah, I have a Patreon. It'll be a link to that will be in the show notes if you feel like reading that or getting early access to podcasts, music, art, all that jazz. The Patreon is there for you. And this first chapter, I know it's like it'll be the first iteration of this chapter. It'll mutate and shift a trillion times. Right now I'm still in this wonderful honeymoon stage of this creative endeavor. I know eventually I will reach a point where I just hate it and everything I've written, and I hate myself, and I'll get sucked into this like abyss of creative despair. But for now, I am absolutely loving the process and learning how to craft these much longer ideas. I feel like any creative thing you do, and I guess this isn't always true. This hasn't always been true for me, but I'd say for the most part, I always hit a point, whether it's writing a song, drawing a picture, making a painting, sculpture, whatever the thing is, like I always hit a point, and I feel like most artists hit a point where they hate it. They take a step back and they are questioning everything they've done, and they are kind of like wondering why they started it and if they should keep going. I feel like that's part of the process. And if you are in that phase of whatever your thing is, whatever you're making, whatever you're doing, that means you're doing good. That means you have been putting in the work to have that level of existential dread about the thing. That means you care about it, and that means you've been putting in the effort. And it's hard to see that in those moments of foggy disassociation from the thing, but it's a good thing. In hindsight, you always, like, creators always come to realize like that was part of this process, and it was a good thing. Right now, to give you a frame of reference, in the past, I've written somewhere between 2,000 and 12,000 words per story or per like part of a story. And I've had multi-parter stories too, where my longest story spanned like 30,000 words. But a book, a novel, it should be anywhere between 75 to 80,000 words. So I still have a very long way to go. If you take all the short stories I've written in the past and added them all together, I would have written more than a novel's worth of words, but I've never written a continuous story that is this long. And honestly, I'm really excited about it because it's just the thought of building a bigger, immersive world that can span out and reach and grab its tendrils out in all different directions is really appealing to me. Anyway, all right, just taking a step back from that. That's been a huge piece of my life, is this writing process, but I won't bore you anymore with that. I will be putting that first chapter's link in the Patreon. Thanksgiving is upon us. The holidays are upon us. The duality of togetherness and simultaneously feeling alone is upon us. But I just want to take a moment to remind you that you are not alone. Even if it feels that way sometimes, you are not alone. You have support. I feel like I've been doing this every episode about giving you a Felix update, my son. So I'm gonna maybe make that a segment, the Felix update, where I give you a little nugget of what's going on in his life. Recently, I've been getting him to say all kinds of things because that's where he's at. He's 2.5, and I get him to say like "cool," "party time," "radical," "tubular," and recently, I have been getting him to say "get to the chopper," which is really funny to hear a little toddler scream "get to the chopper." There's something that just makes me smile about that. I'll spare you the ear beating of my life. I think we're already like 6 minutes into this. So let's get into the topic of today's podcast, which is things that history class got wrong. For some clarification here, these are some things that you may have learned in school that are absolute misinterpretations or total fabrications, things that were laid down in textbooks or told by a teacher that are just plain wrong. Most of these misinterpretations are these untrue things, historical events, and things are going to be centered around the United States, but some of them will be about other countries as well, but most of them will be centered around the United States. The people who win the wars write the history books, and that's something that holds true throughout the passage of time, not just in a United States context or a modern history context. That's just something that's always been the case. And America has been the victor of a lot of the wars in modern history. And for that reason, they write the history books here in America. And they paint the picture, they set the scene, and often mislead people as to what actually happened during historical events. And the history writers of America often frame themselves as heroes and their involvement in historical events as warranted and justified and heroic. And sometimes, sure, that is true. I'm not saying that American history is all devious and everything, but there are a lot of times where that is not true, where they paint themselves as the victors, as the heroes, as the good guys. The history books and those who write them leave out so many unpleasant details. They don't want to look like the villains. They don't want to look evil. And this is true just across the board, globally. This is what the history writers do. Like, why would they include the ugly details about themselves? And they omit large bits of truth. And America especially, and other countries, but America especially, is notorious for integrating large bits of propaganda into the history books, omitting details, inserting propaganda. Most countries are doing this to some extent, though. I don't want to just single out America. This is a global, it's a global phenomenon. Because, it makes sense. Countries don't want their citizens thinking that they live in a country founded on heartless warmongers or slave owners or just terrible people. Even if that was or is the case, it makes sense as to why our history books are often framed the way that they are. And on a positive note here, I think that over time, a lot of our dark history as a country has been exposed, and that there has been a massive movement to not glorify the darkness that was so intertwined with the foundation of our country and other countries. The wool has been lifted. People know that we were lied to in school, and we're growing, we're learning, we're changing as a collective mind. So today I want to go over the truth behind several myths in history. The first one I want to go over involves the Emancipation Proclamation. And that's that the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves. And this is just kind of partially true. A lot of people were taught and currently think that once Lincoln did the thing and Emancipation Proclamation, that slavery ended, and that's just not true. The Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves in states that were in open rebellion, which didn't even include every major slaveholding state, and overall wasn't even 75% of slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation was a presidential move Lincoln could make because of the Civil War, and it did not outlaw slavery or free all of the slaves. That actually came later when the North beat the South. And if you're listening and you're a red hat wearing, orange man loving person with the flag, waving the flag on the truck, and you've got your Southern pride, the North won, buddy. The North won. The slaves were freed, so burn those stupid flags. It's over. We won. Ohio might not have the most sunlight right now, but we were on the right side of that war. So anyway, our next one is the misconception that the U.S. entered World War II to help the Jewish people. The U.S. and a bunch of other countries knew about Hitler rounding up Jewish people and taking them away for a long time. They knew what he was up to. And the US and a bunch of other countries turned away thousands of Jewish refugees, some of them believing that the refugees were Nazi spies. And a lot of Jewish people that were turned away from America ended up back in the hands of the Nazis. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the Allies were the bad guys. America was absolutely on the right side of that war. But America isn't necessarily the good guys that so many movies and books and such paint them to be. And as most people know, the U.S. officially entered the war after Pearl Harbor. It was an attack on American soil that was enough to get us involved. And the UK and France were involved because they were really just fighting for survival. They were in such close proximity to the Nazis. They kind of had to fight. They were pinned against the wall. And does this mean that the U.S. didn't care about the Jewish genocide? Absolutely not. I'm not trying to say that, but it is also absolutely not the primary reason that the U.S. or any of the other countries that got involved. If we look at things kind of in a more modern context, this is apples and oranges. This is a whole different scenario, but kind of segues into a more modern context. I'm sure once the dust settles with Palestine, the history books decades from now will reflect that the U.S. charismatically charged into action to save lives. I hope not, and probably, actually, maybe not. Because like I said before, there's a big revolution happening in terms of pulling the truth out of scenarios and bringing the actual historical information onto the pages rather than framing it in a false way. So I'm hoping not. I'm hoping as we move forward, the history books can remain a bit more accurate than they were. Although not to get super freaking dark here, but with our new orange overlord, who knows what nuggets of history and education will be changed and manipulated or erased. Our next one is the Founding Fathers approved "In God We Trust" and "One Nation Under God." That is just wrong. The Founding Fathers didn't have these phrases. These phrases aren't on the Constitution or in any amendments or were on any government buildings or anything. This is not something that was even on their radar. And so many people talk about how these phrases on our money and statues and buildings, etc., are rooted in American history, that they were approved and signed off on by our founding fathers. And it couldn't be more wrong, because "In God We Trust" was added to our money in 1956 by President Eisenhower. For as many lies as we have been told, generally our founding fathers didn't want to get religion involved with our governments and schools. They were running from that. They were running from a government that persecuted its people for not following certain religions and traditions that came with those religions. They didn't want to keep the ball rolling with that in their new country. And it's so funny how super patriotic, super nationalist people, bald eagles, America, freedom, that are super gung-ho about saying and having swag that involves God. You know, they don't understand that the people who founded this country would not have been about that. They wouldn't have approved that. They'd be mad that these things are fused together. It's just really blatant idiocy to me. If you truly support the founding fathers and the creation of this country, you wouldn't put religious swag on your American swag. You wouldn't do it. But they, for whatever reason, do. And I use the term they like it's very divisive. When I say they, I mean the hyper-nationalist people who are the hyper-nationalist / religious people. I feel like they go hand in hand. But moving on to our next one, we're going to kind of hit on a different topic here. General Custer from Custer's Last Stand was a brave, intelligent leader. And if you don't know who General Custer was, he was one of the last, air quotes here, Indian fighters of the Old West, American military, and he's often portrayed as a bold, smart strategist. That's how I remember reading about him in the history books, and I've actually been to Custer's Last Stand, and there are plaques and diagrams there about his military prowess, or at least there were when I was in the 5th grade. But most of his bravery and boldness and amazingness is just, it's a lie. After he died, his wife lobbied to have a bunch of movies about him made, painting him as this shiny golden hero. And these movies made him seem as though he was a stoic man, that he was hard, that he was a tall man with a fierce gaze, and that he was this expert military strategist. But in reality, historians have come to figure out that he was known for his, I'll say, like, flamboyantness, for wearing like flowing fringe and screaming as he charged into battle and trying to make as big a show as possible. He made decisions that would make things more grandiose rather than anything that resembled military planning. He was a theater massacreist, not to be confused with masochist. Hee. Although, maybe. And it turns out his heroic last stand was simply him charging foolishly into a battleground that had a much greater force than he realized. This next one is so crazy to me. I actually have relatives that still will argue this with me sometimes. And that's that the Native Americans sold the U.S. most of their land. This one is admittedly just asinine. If you believe this, you are you're a special kind of dumb. But some people do, and the history books said it, and some people still hold on to it. And seriously, all jokes aside, though, I get it. The people who still believe this or will defend this, they were brainwashed by history books at a young age, and now that's the version of reality they've constructed, and they just can't let it go. It's not excusable, but by any means, it's not excusable. Do better. Read a book. Learn some stuff. But I get it. Y'all got tricked. I'm going to break this down here. Were there deals with Native Americans and European settlers about land, about transmission of land, or just about land? Yes, there were. But here's a key fundamental piece of how this how all of the ish hit the fan. The native people that were here before the European settlers didn't look at land as something you owned. They looked at it as belonging to everyone, as something that was shared and used by all. The concept of actually owning the land it wasn't even something that they could even really comprehend, because in reality it's just like, let's be honest, that concept is just so dumb. Like, that people could own land. It's just so dumb. And these settlers, they came from a place where owning land meant power. It meant you were part of the gentry, and that if you owned land, you'd have a stake in the laws of those lands and the goings on of the high tiers of society. They thought about land ownership. Well, they thought about land ownership, period. And this concept was so foreign and so out of the box for the native people that when they were presented with it, like, hey, we would like to buy your land, they assumed that the European settlers were saying, hey, do you mind if we just like chill here with you? We'll give you some gold or goods if we can chill here with you. And the native people were basically like, yeah, you can chill here. The earth is for everyone. Oh, and you want to give us gifts too. That's cool. That's awesome. That's nice of you. I also don't want to paint this as, I don't want to leave you thinking that the Native Americans weren't capable of understanding land ownership, though. There was fighting in the Americas before the European settlers got here. A lot of that fighting was over who had a sacred right to be on pieces of land and utilize its gifts. But in terms of actually owning the land itself with a deed from a bank and a bunch of paperwork and nonsense, they weren't doing that. They weren't hip to that. That wasn't even something they would have ever thought about. So with that, in some cases, the Native Americans would also take payment from European settlers to stay on land temporarily as kind of a lease agreement. And of course, the European settlers took this as, oh, you're going to sell us 40,000 acres of land for $23? Sure. Well, yeah, let's make that deal. And that wasn't the deal that the Native Americans thought they were making at all whatsoever. And the rest is history. The European settlers massacred them, enslaved them, and it was all of this was the biggest theft of land in global history. That's where we live today. And this next one kind of dovetails off of my point about in God we trust and all that. And that's that the separation of church and state is not in the founding documents at all. There's a lot of debate and arguing around this topic. Some people argue that they should be completely separated, while others say as long as one doesn't become a state religion, we should be able to have the Bible or any other religious text in schools and other institutions. As much as I'd like it to be in the Constitution, it isn't. What is in the Constitution is, quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. I'm going to read that again. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. An incredibly on the fence stance. And that's because the old white dudes that wrote this had such varying opinions on religion and government that they had to write it in a way that would appeal to all of them. And I can, I imagine them all at the end of the day just like sweaty and stinking and aggravated, just wanting to get home to their slave-run households. Like, all right, damn it, fine. We'll just write it this way. Is everybody happy? All right, you're happy. Okay, we're happy. And that's why it's such a just like, we didn't take a stance on this because honestly, it's lazy. To me, it's very lazy. It's like, just write it. Just give the country a direction here. Like, you guys are the, quote, founding fathers. Give us something. Don't just be on the fence like this. It's lazy. It's lazy writing. And this is where we get a lot of the pushback from institutions like the Church of Satan. And blessed to them. Blessed to the Church of Satan. Essentially, they're saying, fine, you want to put scripture in school? We want to put statues of Baphomet in schools, and you want to put the 10 Commandments at the entrance of colleges. We want to put the tenets of our church there as well. And personally, I think that there should be, if we're gonna do this, if we're gonna bring in theology, if we're gonna bring in religion into our schools, which I think it should go either. Personally, I feel like it should go one way or the other. We either just exclude it, or we include everything. And I think that maybe that might be the more productive way to go about it. The problem is finding people who can teach religion in schools that aren't biased one way or another. That's the component of it that bothers me. But in a perfect world, I think that there should be more religious studies in school. And not just one religion, but all religions. There needs to be this open and honest dialogue about spiritual belief systems in schools starting at a young age. Because that's one of the hardest things to wrap your mind around when you're a developing mind. Like, why are we here? Who made all this? What are my options? And we should give kids options and tell them about different spiritual paths and not force them or sway them in any direction. And like I said, in the United States, that's where the problem lies. That's why it might be dangerous to do this. But other countries teach kids about different religions. And it's weird that in the US we don't. It's not a part of our curriculum. And it's almost like we're a Christian-dominated theological oligarchy. Strange. Anyway, let's move on to our next one. And this one's going to be polarizing for people. And I'm just going to, I'm going to lay it out here the best way that I can. The Taliban had nothing to do with 9/11. I just want to say for the record, the whole thing is super sus. Did 9/11 happen? Absolutely yes, it did. Did a lot of people die? Absolutely yes. Was it a tragedy? Absolutely yes, without question. It happened. People died. It was a tragedy. As to the actual mechanisms and organizations involved with all of this destruction, that is all questionable, and we as the public will probably never know what actually happened. I personally believe that the towers and Building 7 were controlled implosions. And for what purposes and meaning, I don't know. There are a quintillion theories. However, the information that the news gave us, the information that we have been given, it was also false and later corrected after the hysteria of the entire attack settled down a bit. The information that we were initially given was that Osama bin Laden had ties to the Taliban and that the Taliban was guilty of sheltering him. But they denied involvement from anything from the start, and they denied sheltering Osama bin Laden. They actually said they could get him, that they had access to capturing him, and that they would extradite him to an Arab country to stand trial under Islamic law. And the U.S. refused that offer. They refused working with the Taliban and having them send Osama bin Laden to face a trial. So the people who were eventually alleged as the attackers were all from Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. And the majority of the people who were allegedly involved were from countries that the U.S. was allied with. And these countries, that isn't to say these countries didn't or don't currently have anti-American extremist groups in them, because they do. So all of this all of this Osama bin Laden Taliban situation, according to the information we were given, it was initially just wrong. So many people today still think that 9/11 was orchestrated by the Taliban, which, according to news outlets and government institutions, is false. And a lot of people still think that Iraq had something to do with it. Because during this time, things were very volatile between Iraq and the United States, and people just started believing that Iraq was involved. Whenever people would say it, the narrative was also never corrected because the U.S. government wanted to go to Iraq at that time, so they kind of were just like, yeah, sure, Iraq too, they're bad too, because they wanted to find these, quote, weapons of mass destruction, which, for the record, we never found or procured any said weapons. So just to clarify here, because it can be slightly confusing, and I don't want to further mislead people, Osama bin Laden was involved and responsible for the 9/11 attacks, along with Al-Qaeda. The Taliban, which was initially alleged to have worked with Osama bin Laden to orchestrate these terrorist attacks, was not responsible. And they actually offered to help get bin Laden prosecuted. And once again, all this information is open for debate. People, this is one of the most debated tragedies in human history, in modern human history. And what the actual information is behind the scenes, we will probably never know. But this is the narrative that has been the most accepted and the one that has been presented as factual information. Moving on to our next and our last lie, or untruth, or however you want to dice this up, and that is the misconception that the Constitution is unchangeable. And this phenomenon is really interesting because the Constitution has so many amendments already. The Founding Fathers knew that our country would grow and change, and for as big of scumbags as most of the Founding Fathers were, they realized that it needed to be flexible, that the Constitution needed to be flexible. So they wrote it in such a way as to have amendments, as to be able to be changed. And we already have so many amendments. They knew we were going to need to update things. It's a lot like computer software. Like, why would we keep running on outdated software on our phones and computers and other devices? We patch it, we update it, we make it better, we allow it to be malleable and changeable. And there's so many things like abortion and global pollution and computers that they just wouldn't have been concepts. They wouldn't have been on the radar of the Founding Fathers when they were writing the Constitution. But they did have the foresight to know that there would be things that would arise that would need laws written about them and guidelines written about them. Thomas Jefferson, one of the Founding Fathers, and honestly, I'm not a big fan of the term Founding Father. I think we need to change that, like the old writers. Can we get something else? Can we do a poll here? Like what's another name for the Founding Fathers? I think that's too grandiose of a word for them. Anyway, Thomas Jefferson wanted the Constitution to be reevaluated every generation, the entire system. And he wanted people to see if the system still worked for their version of the United States, or if starting over fresh might be necessary. And today, that can kind of be a scary thought, like the government being able to rewrite everything not based on the will of the people. And honestly, I'm sure it was probably a scary thought back then too, and that's why they didn't adopt that thought or put that thought into it. They're like, I don't know, that seems kind of sus. I'm not going to go doom and gloom. I'm not going to do all that. I'm going to stay hopeful. And has my faith in our country waned to a sliver? Have I lost hope in the judicial system? Am I worried about the future of this country for my child and every child's sake? Tune in next time to find out on Outdated America. Let's get on with the next segment of the show I like to call Let's Ask AI.
Let's ask AI.
I asked AI, with the current state of the United States and the average shelf life of nations, where do you see the United States in 100 years? What do our laws and rights look like? Will the United States even exist? An AI replied, "This is an interesting and complex speculative scenario that requires careful analysis. I'll break down some potential trajectories while acknowledging the inherent uncertainty of long-term geopolitical predictions." And they gave me a super long response. I'm going to go over some of these, but I don't think I'm going to touch on all of them. Potential scenarios for the United States in the year 2124. Continued federal existence, the most likely scenario in that the United States continues to exist, but likely in a transformed state. Historical precedent shows that stable democracies tend to adapt rather than collapse. Potential changes might include more decentralized governance, significant constitutional amendments addressing technological and social challenges, potentially restructured representation systems to account for demographic shifts. 2. Structural political transformations, increased likelihood of significant electoral and governmental reforms, potential breakup into more regionally autonomous zones or states with greater independent powers, possible implementation of new democratic mechanisms leveraging technology. 3. Rights and legal landscape, extended digital rights and privacy protections, more comprehensive environmental and climate change related legal frameworks, potentially redefined citizenship concepts accounting for global mobility and digital identities, enhanced protections around artificial intelligence, genetic technologies, and emerging biotechnologies. I'm just going to run the rest because I've read most of these. So, number 4, democratic and geopolitical considerations, significant population shifts due to climate migration, potential loss of coastal territories due to sea level rise, changing ethnic and age demographics potentially reshaping political landscapes. 5. Global context factors, reducing global geopolitical dominance compared to current status, politically more multipolar world order, increased economic competition from emerging global powers. This projection assumes relative stability and incremental change. Extreme scenarios like total collapse or radical transformation remain possible, but less probable. The United States has historically demonstrated remarkable resilience, adaptability, and capacity for reinvention. While significant challenges exist, the nation's institutional frameworks and cultural dynamism suggest continuity with substantial evolution. I feel like that is a pretty positive outlook on the whole thing. Thank you to AI for adding some light into this perspective. I love this. And honestly, every time I ask AI a question for this podcast, it gives me a pretty positive response. So I like that they addressed a lot of the problems, but they also offered a lot of solutions, and they didn't give energy to the darkness of the direction that the country could go in. They're like, we're making it, y'all. We're going to do this. Here are options. Here are ways that we can do better and be better as a country and as a people. And I like that. I think that's the way we need to, I think that's the track we need to stay on. And it can be hard at times. It can be really hard not to just bang your head against the wall, be like, why? But that's not very productive. So let's try to keep ourselves from banging our heads against the walls. Moving on to the last segment of the podcast. These aren't necessarily, they're all historical facts, but they're not necessarily involved with government or misinformation or anything like that. They're just, this is going to be more of just a list of fun, interesting facts from the past. Our first one is the ancient Egyptians used honey as a form of medical treatment and currency. They were so advanced in beekeeping that archaeological evidence shows they were producing honey over 4,500 years ago. I love honey. It's in my coffee right now. I drink it all the time. It's a magical, wonderful substance. Our next fun fact is that the Romans had a complex system of public toilets where people would sit next to each other and chat while using the facilities. They even had a communal sponge on a stick used for cleaning that was shared between users. Ew. Our next fun fact is that the world's oldest known living tree, a bristlecone pine in California named Methuselah, is over 4,800 years old and was already ancient when the pyramids were built. Talk about a mother tree. I bet the mycorrhizal network is vast. Next fun fact is that Iceland has no mosquitoes. It's the only country in the world with zero native mosquito population due to its unique climate conditions. And I wanted to take this moment to announce, to let all the listeners know that I am actually moving to Iceland later this year. It's been fun in the United States, but it's just time. I think it's just time. All right, our next fun fact is, in ancient Greece, throwing an apple at someone was a traditional marriage proposal. If the person caught it, it was considered acceptance. And our last fun fact is, the Kingdom of Bhutan measures national success through gross national happiness instead of purely economic indicators. What a wonderful thought. What a wonderful way of looking at how well your country is doing. How happy are the people? Isn't that the metric we should be basing our country's success on? I think it is. We are in a wild time here in the US. I'm not sure what our happiness factor is. I'm not sure where we're at with that. And I promise, though, things are going to get better. Perspective is everything. So please, please, please consider putting yourself in someone else's shoes. Open your heart to the thought that we are literally all in this thing together. No one knows what to do. And we are figuring all of this out as we go along. Before I leave you, I'm going to give myself an opportunity for one last plug. Click that rating/like button. Leave that review. Tell a friend. There's also a link to join my Patreon in the show's notes. However you support, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Remember to check on your mental health, and remember to check on the mental health of your loved ones. Until next time, bye.
Thoughts. Analog thoughts.
Analog thoughts.
Analog thoughts. Analog thoughts.
Analog thoughts. Analog thoughts. Analog thoughts.